Levirate marriage is a topic in the book of Ruth that needs a little explanation. Let me read briefly from Deuteronomy 25, verses 5 through 10. If brothers dwell together and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the dead shall not be married outside the family to a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go into her, take her as his wife, and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. And the first son whom she bears shall succeed to the name of his brother who is dead, that his name may not be blotted out of Israel. And if the man does not wish to take his brother's wife, then his brother's wife shall go up to the gate of the elders and say, My husband's brother refuses to perpetuate his brother's name in Israel. He will not perform the duty of the husband's brother to me. Then the elders of the city shall call him, speak to him, and if he persists, saying, I do not wish to take her, then his brother's wife shall go up to him in the presence of the elders, and pull his sandal off his foot, and spit in his face, and she shall answer and say, So shall it be done to the man who does not build up his brother's house. And the name of his house shall be called in Israel, the house of him that had his sandal pulled off. Levirate marriage is important because it comes up in the book of Ruth along with the topic, theme, kinsman redeemer. Here at the end of chapter 4, they're kind of woven together, and we're trying to clarify exactly what's going on. Levirate comes from the Latin root levir, which means husband's brother. In Hebrew, the term is yibum. According to the Old Testament, levirate marriage required a family member to marry his deceased brother's childless widow in order to carry on the brother's name. The point was to prevent the deceased man's name from dying out and to ensure that the land that was his inheritance would be kept within the family and not lost. So in this case, Ruth, who was Mahlon's wife, her husband Mahlon died, and so did the brother as well, Chilion. So there was no one there to fulfill the obligation to Ruth so that she could have a child which would carry on the name. If there was a party, a brother, and he refused to go through the marriage, both were required to go through a ceremony called halitzah, which was a symbolic act of passing a shoe and spitting. This act was a renunciation or a refusal of the duty to perform the marriage. Most likely, this levirate marriage and the halitzah, the refusal that we just read about in Deuteronomy 25, comes from Genesis 38, which is the story of Judah and Tamar. Judah, if you'll remember, is one of the 12 sons of Jacob, and he marries a Canaanite woman and has 3 sons, Onan, and Shelah. He finds a wife for his oldest son, and her name is Tamar. But was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death. So Judah gave Tamar to Onan, the second son, who was responsible to fulfill the duty to produce offspring for But Onan spilled his seed on the ground, not fulfilling his obligation, so the Lord put him to death, which leaves Shelah in line, but Shelah was too young. In the meanwhile, Judah's wife died, and the whole situation kind of changes because Judah makes himself absent. Essentially, he's handling business. He goes up to Timnah to handle the selling or the shearing of the sheep. And so when Tamar hears about that, she took matter into her own hands rather than waiting for Shelah. She essentially disguised herself as a prostitute and went to him. In payment for her services, she required that Judah give her his staff and seal, and then disappears. When it was found out later that Tamar was pregnant, Judah, not knowing that he was the father or that she was the prostitute, condemned her to death, but then she appealed to the owner of the staff and seal, revealing Judah to be the father. She gave her two sons names. The first was Perez, and Perez, we note in the end of the genealogy, or the end of chapter 4 in the genealogy, that Perez was a direct relative to Boaz. Boaz was a descendant of Perez. So familially, there's a connection, but also according to the theme or this concept, this law, Levirate Marriage, there is a parallel as well. So that's pretty neat. The unwillingness or the refusal to participate in this obligation is what was called the removal of the shoe, or the halitzah. So it was two stages. There was a removing of the shoe, and there was a spitting. The removal of the shoe was representative of the refusal to the obligation to be married, if the shoe fits, so to speak. But the spitting act was symbolic of Onan spilling his seed rather than fulfilling his obligation. The ceremony itself was symbolic of their refusal, one party or both, to follow through, but it was also symbolic of the shaming act, whereas it says there, the house of him, and the name of the house shall be called in Israel, the house of him that had his sandal pulled off. So there was a shaming sense to it. The second example of Levirate marriage is found in our book, in the book of Ruth. In Ruth chapter 1, Naomi references a Levirate marriage as she urges her daughter-in-laws, Orpah and Ruth, to return to their families in Moab. In chapter 1, verse 11, she says, "Do I have sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Even if I should have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait till they were grown? Even if she should bear sons who could enter into Levirate unions with these daughters, it would be unreasonable to expect Ruth and Orpah to wait until the sons were old enough to marry. Therefore, because Naomi's sons were dead and she had no hope of bearing others, her daughters-in-law were free of, or she was releasing her daughters-in-law of any obligation to wait." In Ruth chapter 4, after a series of events in chapter 2 and 3, the introduction of Boaz and God's providence leading Ruth and Boaz together, and then in chapter 3, Naomi recognizing God's hand in this, bringing a kinsman redeemer, a Goel, into the situation. Naomi orchestrates the events that Ruth proposes essentially to Boaz to be the kinsman redeemer, but he reveals that there is another, which kind of transitions into chapter 4. He promises that the situation would be resolved that day. And so the scene in chapter 4 is the resolution, the settlement of this situation. It's an interesting turn of events. Boaz goes to the gate, the city gate, and he gathers the elders and the nearest kinsmen at the city gate and announces the purpose of the gathering is to redeem the land Naomi is selling to pay the bills. Up to this point, there's been no mention of Naomi selling land because of debt or because of financial need. So here we see Boaz using this as an opportunity, essentially, to bring in this kinsman to resolve this issue. The resolution of the land debt, or redeeming the land, is according to the text in Leviticus 25 in the year of Jubilee, or the resolution of land debt, or the kinsman redeemer and how they redeemed land, someone from slavery, essentially paying that debt, or the person being rescued by the year of Jubilee. So at first it appears just to be a kinsman redeemer in that respect pertaining to the land. But then, which the first redeemer is willing to participate in, but then Boaz adds an addendum, kind of an addition, an amendment, so to speak, there at the end. And he says, and also whoever redeems Naomi's land also has to marry Ruth, who happens to be the daughter-in-law of Naomi, which kind of shifts the gears here because it's not a direct, it's an assimilation, it's an addition to, it's not directly involved yet, and there's no law directly resolving this problem. It's something that the men, the elders at the gate, have to resolve. But they just can't leave her out because she's a member of the family. So the first kinsman, he refuses that obligation when he learns that Ruth is a part of the settlement. And when he refuses his option, that opens the door to Boaz to redeem the land and also to acquire Ruth. So there are a few problems here. A shoe is passed, but there was no spitting. The text says in chapter 4, verse 7, now in the earliest times in Israel, for the redemption and transfer of property to become final, one party took off a sandal and gave it to another. This was the method of legalizing transactions in Israel. But the halitzah required both parties, or two aspects of it, the removal of the shoe and the spitting. So we have the passing of the shoe, but we don't have any spitting. So then we have, the text says in chapter 4, verse 10, I have also acquired Ruth the Moabitess, Mahlon's widow, as my wife in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property so that his name will not disappear from among his family or from the town records. So here, Levirate marriage is brought in because it's intentional to maintain the name of Mahlon with his property and to enter it into the town records. So you have an acquisition of land, but yet because Ruth is a daughter-in-law, someone's got to take responsibility for her as well. So using Levirate marriage as a guide, Boaz sets himself up to, possibly knowing that the first kinsman was maybe married. He wasn't interested in that. He would be interested in getting property, but as soon as he gained Ruth, then he would not have anything to gain. He would essentially be rescuing Naomi and then passing along the property and his investment in that property to an heir, which would make it a loss to him. But to Boaz, it would be a gain. So we have both principles being combined here. The first being pretty clear. You have the kinsman redeemer purchasing the land, but the second, Levirate marriage, is not quite as clear. There's a couple other issues. Neither of these men, as kinsman redeemers, are direct relatives of Mahlon. They are brothers, so to speak, of Elimelech. And Ruth is not present in the scenario. Boaz is handling the situation at the gate with the first kinsman himself. So there seems to be an absence of a complete active refusal, which was the halitzah ceremony. So what I conclude is that neither party is directly responsible or obligated to marry Ruth, but she's involved in the estate settlement, which Boaz understands that the first kinsman is not interested in, yet Boaz is interested and more than willing to participate in. He made that commitment to Ruth in chapter 3. So therefore, since both parties are concerned relatives, yet no one is directly responsible for Ruth, there's a cordial passing of the shoe, which is the standard for the passing of property, transfer of ownership, and leaving out the shaming act of the spitting for refusal. So the biblical goal of levirate marriage is to preserve the land of the Israelites and to protect the individual family name. In the book of Ruth, the final settlement seems to be a combination of the levirate marriage and kinsman redeemer laws. The land transfer is a clear-cut issue, but Ruth added a twist which had to be handled justly, even though the law did not directly address this particular type situation. So we need to remember that the law is a guide to handle situations justly and to protect all interests and parties involved, resulting in the glory of God. Just as the true intention of the law was not a fulfillment of the letter of the law, but to lead us to Christ. It was not an end in itself. Finally, the focus of the author is to bring us to see not only God's handiwork in the direction of events that transpired, but to point us to his faithfulness to his promises to provide an ultimate kinsman or redeemer who is faithful to his promises to redeem his people, to deliver them to the promised land, that we as people would bear his name and be his bride forever.